Hayes. I'm one of the Paradoxa Collective artists who have curated and coordinated the Divine Days Traditional Burning and Botany in Conversation event here today at Bunjil Reserve in Panton Hill and on Zoom via the World Wide Web. We do have actually 400, nearly 500 people registered. We've only got 93 people at the moment, so who knows what's happened to the other couple of hundred. Hopefully they'll be able to join in over time. So just a few housekeeping things before we start. The event's supposedly going to run for an hour and a half, but we'll just see where it wanders. And if you need to leave, just take off if that's what you need to do. The first hour we're dedicating to Uncle Dave and David Cameron, chatting about all things botany, cultural burning and all things in between. But if you need to ask a question, put it in the Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And it's a webinar, so your mic and your camera, if you're a participant, is turned off throughout the session. We'll probably be walking around a fair bit, so if you're starting to feel a bit of motion sickness, maybe just minimise our views while we wander. But we're going to start off here at the Maya Maya at the entrance of the Bunjil Reserve. The Paradoxa Collective would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Nillumbik Shire Council in helping us make the event possible. Brad Tadday from the Environment team at Nillumbik is here with us today, and we just really wanted to acknowledge his support, and particularly that we've worked with him for 5 years or so over here at Bunjil Reserve, and I think we feel like we're pretty good mates now. Some kind of sound going on there anyway. So obviously the most important thing to acknowledge is our two speakers today, who are Wurundjeri Elder Uncle Dave Wandin, who is a firestick farming and cultural burning expert, and Uncle Dave has worked here on Bunjil Reserve and all over Wurundjeri country, caring for it on a practical level for many, many years, and always has something interesting to say. So we're really looking forward to it today. David Cameron is a senior botanist at the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. David is also a dad at the school I went to as a child in the 1980s, and he was responsible for cordoning off a large section of bushland surrounding the classrooms to protect its high environmental values, including some rare orchids and other plant species. So thanks, guys, for being here today. And just before I hand over to them, I'd like to do a acknowledgement of country. I acknowledge that I am on the sacred sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri, of the Woiwurrung language group of the Kulin Nations, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. I acknowledge that Wurundjeri have cared for country for tens of thousands of years and continue to do so. I acknowledge Wurundjeri elders, past, present and future, and obviously would particularly like to acknowledge Uncle Dave, who's here with us today.
Email. Oh yeah, I've got it.
Hey, Pen and Anna, can you mute yourselves? Sorry, we can hear you. I thought it would be nice for everyone who is online if you would like to acknowledge what country you are on. Where are you now? Whose traditional land or country are you on? And maybe you could put that in the chat so everyone who's watching can see where everyone is at the moment. I thought that would be a lovely thing to know. I've still got a little bit more to go. My acknowledgements may be a little bit too long, but anyway. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm descended from white privilege over 4 or 5 generations in so-called Australia. I was born on the unceded land of Bunjil people in the Mornington Peninsula, and I've lived most of my life on unceded Wurundjeri country. A couple of days ago, a friend shared her partner's notion of the white privilege lullaby. I just wanted to briefly share this idea with you, as it really resonated with me, and I think it will with quite a few of you. The white privilege lullaby is, like all good lullabies, simple and repetitive. Its hypnotic nature lulls the listener into inertia by telling them that white people are entitled to everything, entitled to it all, at the expense of everything and everyone else. If you happen to be white, it's a lovely and easy song to listen to because it lovingly says that you should have it all just because you have pale skin. It's pretty racist, and if you don't happen to be white, it's often lethal. People do terrible things listening to the white lullaby, like the Rio Tinto did a couple of weeks ago when they blasted a 46,000-year-old sacred site and thought it was their right to do so. I think that's obviously pretty atrocious that the law told them also that it was okay to do it. The white privilege lullaby has been sung for far too long now. Other discordant melodies reveal painful histories and experiences that, whilst very hard for white people to hear, need to be heard because they are truthfully what has happened. It has long been time for these other songs to be heard, so let's turn the volume up and hear them loud and clear. So I want to acknowledge that I've listened to and benefited from the insidious racist lullaby and say that whilst it's been easy for me to listen to it, the tune is actually rubbish. I'm very keen to hear more of the truth. I'm also very keen to hear about the dynamic ways of knowing nature and caring for country. So on that note, I'm going to hand over and get out of the screen. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Suri. It wasn't too long of an acknowledgement, and I thank you for that acknowledgement and your respect to my ancestors and my elders and also my people living here today. I was going to have a smoking fire for you, but holding the camera at the same time and trying to keep a fire going is a little bit difficult. So I'll do a welcome to country. For those of you who have not seen me before, I don't speak much language. It's one of the things that was lost through colonisation, but the few words that I do know, I think it'll make it easier for you to remember. And they are just 3 words. And it is Waminjika, Wurundjeri Biak, which simply means welcome to Wurundjeri country. I pay my respects to my ancestors and my elders past and present for the knowledge that they have been able to pass down to me. I pay my respects to all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are with us today in this webinar, wherever you may be. I pay my respects to your elders and your ancestors, both past and present, but also your elders emerging. And then most importantly, I pay my respects to our creator spirits. And we have 2 main creator spirits. And the first is Bunjil, the wedge-tailed eagle. He is our father, our creator. I pay my respects to him for all the knowledge that he has left in the landscape for us as Aboriginal people, and hopefully in time, everybody who lives in the Australian landscape can able, through education, learn how to interpret and care for it. And finally, I pay my respects to the spirit of our mother, which of course is the earth on which we all stand, on which we need to live, breathe, shelter us and feed us. Without these 2 creators, we would not be here. It is very important that Bunjil only put down one law first, and that was that we must care for mother. We call it caring for country these days, and I think we should return it back to caring for mother. Because in our cultural law, just as our physical mother raises us when we are children and teaches us all that we need to know, as she gets in her twilight years, we return the favour by caring for her, our physical mother. It is the same when we look at the land that we are on and consider the spirit of the land that has cared for us as children, cares for us during our young adulthood, and then becomes our responsibility to return that favour and care for the spirit of our mother, to care for country. Once you understand all the intricacies that make up this wonderful land, you can then go through the initiation phase. You can then raise your own family. You can then contribute to your community. Excuse me. Because as much as we all know, yeah, we are humans and we are here to raise families. That's what we do. And these days, there are thousands of books on how to raise children. But when you have that first child and you bring that baby home, all those books go out the window because nothing is what it says in the books. And you have to ask your elders, what do I do? You ring your mum, your dad, your mother-in-law, your father-in-law, you ring your sister, your uncle, whoever, and they will tell you this way and that way, but eventually you work it out yourself because you interpret that child the same way. But if you had the knowledge on how to interpret the land and understand the intricacies of how the trees interact with the birds, and how the land interacts with the worms and the ants, and how the water and the fish interact with the land and the trees, and how everything is tied together. We call it the circle of knowledge, circle of living knowledge. Unless you have a basic understanding of how that all operates, you will never be able to successfully raise a child. So that's why it's important for us to listen to Bunjil's law, to learn to care for country, so that we can then care for ourselves and our descendants for future generations. Waminjika, Wurundjeri, Biak, welcome to Wurundjeri country. I should have said, my name is Dave Wandin. They do call me uncle. I have no biological brothers or sisters, but I am an uncle through respect, through being able to have the opportunity at places like here, Bunjil Reserve, working alongside Paradoxa Collective and Nillumbik Shire Council and many other councils across Wurundjeri country, to be able to share our knowledge and hopefully by joining together, as we will be shortly, with science, by sharing our ancient knowledge, combining it with the modern knowledge which is being discovered all the time, that we can actually walk country together. That way we can heal country together. Because once we have healthy country, we then have healthy people. And we can all truly call ourselves Australians, not white or black or in between, but just Australians. Now, let me see if I can get this little smoking going here. I'm going to turn the camera around. Let me just reverse this camera. There we go. And watch me cheat with a lighter. I did one of these the other day, and I had a film crew that was doing it. They said, we better do a rehearsal first. And it was a good thing we did, because my fires ended up a bit like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And that was, the first one was too cold, the second one was too hot, and once they turned the camera off, it was just right. Now, the importance of the smoking ceremony. As we walk through the day, I will talk more and more about smoke, not the actual fire. But it is something that we all do as mobs today when we do gather together, to show respect to the country that we are meeting on, also to show respect for each other. The smoking is not just because it looks pretty, it actually has a real purpose. The purpose is we always burn eucalyptus leaves, because eucalyptus leaves are a very, very strong medicine. And what they are meant to do, when you get the fire right, which means you get the smoke right to produce the right chemicals, is that you get a feeling of well-being, an actual healing of your spirit, as well as your physical self. That's a little bit hot at the moment. That's good. We'll get a nice little bit of smoke happening. And the idea is, when you see people walk through the smoke, it is actually to breathe the smoke in. And it gives you a calming effect, so that when you are gathered together to share information, to do trade with your neighbouring tribes, to settle disputes, that they are done in a manner of respect for the country that you are on, and respect for each other, that everyone has a voice to be heard. We all look at our own faces. We have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. And that is so that we spend twice our time listening, twice our time looking, and only 1 time to state your case. So we ask everybody that's here today, and we're all going to do it, even the ones who think that they shouldn't be here, but they're all allowed, they have been welcomed, to actually walk through the smoke. Hope I haven't smothered it out too much there. Beautiful. And that's almost working well. And it's very simple that when you walk through the smoke, most people are a bit nervous, but think of the things that you love the most, whether it be an object, whether it be your child, your mother, your father, or your partner. You walk through the smoke and actually grab it and give it a hug, so that it actually washes over you, and breathe it in. I don't care who goes next. There is no right of who should go through. It would be if there were other Aboriginal people or Wurundjeri people with me today that would walk through it first. But I'm going to ask David Cameron, even though he hasn't had his chance to speak yet, but to come through first. And then, of course, our host for the day, Siri. And our other two observers, if you wouldn't mind walking through and coming on the camera. Fantastic. And now our backup camera person. Thank you very much. I hope that makes you all feel a little bit more calm. We're always nervous doing these things in this modern technology these days. But as I've always said, it is a combination of modern technology and ancient knowledge that will heal this country. I'm now going to hand over and let David Cameron introduce himself. I've worked with Dave on a few minor projects and presented alongside him, and I respect his scientific knowledge and wisdom as he respects my knowledge. And I hope that by combining the two of us today, that we can actually share that knowledge and show you how by working together, we can achieve the best outcomes for this land that we call home. So thank you very much, Dave. And I'll leave it up to you now. And you'll notice that he has it all written down. We are an oral history. I still only do oral stuff. I don't write things down. But Dave's probably got some reading out to do for you. Yeah, if you can hang on to it. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, no, this is better. Oh, sorry, everyone. There we go.
All right, look, my name's David Cameron, and yes, I'm Senior Botanist for the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, but I'm also a local resident. I've spent most of my life in what is now Nillumbik Shire, and I've also spent pretty much all of my adult life and much of my childhood on Wurundjeri land. And I'm not going to read anything because what I've brought is, and you might wonder, what am I clutching? I'm clutching a species list, which as a botanist, I've been compiling for many years on the tiny little bit of land, which is my own personal area of custodianship. That is 1 hectare of land in North, well, I would like it to be North Wurundjeri. It's technically in research, close to where I grew up. And this tiny little piece of clapped out land, most of it is farmland. It's got goats on it. It's got a lot of weeds, but it's also got a scrap of bushland. I've been documenting the entire wild flora of this little tiny piece of land in the little bit of adjacent roadside over many years now. And I have more than 400 different plant species or subspecies, many of them weeds, but an awful lot of them native, some of them quite rare and threatened. And really what I'm clutching this to do is to explain that as someone with a personal connection to a tiny scrap of land for which I'm responsible for its current management, and I've been living there now for, we've owned this for roughly 35 years. And I'll come back later to the significance of that 35-year point of demarcation in time. Having documented 400 plants in 1 hectare of land is an illustration that as a person of predominantly European ancestry, with a bit of Swiss and German background in there, which gives me that particular contribution that Germanic peoples have had of being very good documenters of detail. Wherever they've gone around the world, some of the earliest people from Europe that were documenting the flora and the fauna of Australia, which of course the Aboriginal peoples had done for tens of thousands of years before them, they were very good at observing, making lists, just like I'm doing here, and contributing this to European science. And by me doing in their footsteps the same scientific documentation, I'm actually doing something that all of our ancestors, no matter where in the world we come from, no matter what our ethnic background is, we all are descended from hundreds of thousands of years of peoples of all different colours and stripes and ethnicities and local affiliations, where we have known every single plant that was in the land that was within our custody. All of our ancestors knew, like me, all the 400 species growing immediately around them. And every person who has Aboriginality of any kind in their blood, and we all do, whether we understand it, recognize it, try to wake it up, nourish it again, we all have within us the trade secrets of what it is to, if we like in modern terms, own a piece of land or simply have responsibility or custody for that land, to know and understand all the plants, all the animals, how they fit together to make communities. And so I'm simply following in the footsteps of my ancestors and the ancestors of everyone on earth, where for nearly all of that enormous span of time, as I say, hundreds of thousands of years, in fact, probably as much as 2 million years, all of our ancestors have needed to know exactly what was living with them and understand the relationships between all those plants and animals and themselves, and in having that custody, to understand what was at stake, what was at risk, and in modern, in modern form, what that means in modern jurisdictions like the state of Victoria, the country of Australia, and the global community. We have endless lists in Germanic style where we list all the things that are rare or threatened and all the things that contribute significantly as keystone species to all the different plants and communities. And I've spent all of my professional life documenting the plants, not the animals so much, but in my own case as a botanist, as a professional botanist, documenting all the plants that occur at every point on the landscape, in every community and in every region, just like this tiny little piece of land here, and putting all that data together, pooling it all, analysing it, and then coming to terms with what are the things that are not just rare, which is a natural phenomenon. Most things are rare, very few are widespread and common numerically. So rarity is the common situation for plants and animals the world over, and abundance is something that belongs to relatively few of the component flora and fauna of any part of the world at any scale. And so by documenting the things that are rare and in particular threatened, we now have endless lists that are both legislative and they're what we call authoritative lists that remind us that we are responsible for the trajectory through time, particularly in these troubled, highly stressed modern periods that we're now entering, or have been in for really several hundred years of extreme dominance by European cultural attitude to custody of land, where, and that goes back a long way. It goes back actually several thousand years to the emergence of major civilizations, particularly in the Near East, in the Middle East in particular. They're the ones from which Western technological supremacy have descended. And through that quite recent period, so many plants and animals have come, and some of them have tipped over that threshold of extinction. And my job today in the department is to analyse, to document and create the list of things that are actually truly threatened with various risks of extinction. And my department has right now just reached the end of a milestone, which for me has been a labour of love in the department for the last 20 years, using International Union for Conservation of Nature criteria to document this red list status of all the plants. For me, it's plants. For other people, it's the animals. The status in Victoria as the jurisdiction for which I'm responsible for that list have been for many years now. It's a highly collaborative effort by many people. And the department has, since the 1st of June, with the enactment of a revised version of the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, we are now about to put out for public comment the revised list of rare and threatened plants and animals using red list criteria for the first time in Victoria, uniformly, consistent with every other jurisdiction in Australia. It's an international, it's an agreement across the entire continent, and it's growing in strength throughout the world to use these criteria for consistency, transparency, and to thoroughly document the reasons why we consider various plants or animals to be highly threatened. So I've been in the game of documenting the progressive extinction of our flora. That's been my particular personal professional responsibility for many years now. And so I'm very, very close to these lists and the data that's behind them. I've been the curator, the botanical curator of the state's biological database, really since the mid-90s. So I've been doing that for a quarter of a century. But I thought before I finish my introductory remarks that I should come back to that figure of 35 years. As I said, I've grown up in this area. I've actually lived where I live now for almost 35 years. I actually was in North Wurundjeri, where my parents built a house that was starting to be constructed at the time of the 1962 severe fire that burnt right through that area. Then in the middle of the 60s, there was another fire, which happened not to burn the property where my parents had brought our family up. But in 1969, I was a teenager with my father, and all the women folk, my four sisters, my mother, a woman from next door, were all inside the house. We lived through the next fire. And some parts of that Wurundjeri area, particularly around North Wurundjeri to research, and then up towards Panton Hill here, some areas burnt 3 times between 1962 and 1969. So what this means is that we were living in an environment where the bush burnt 3 times in 7 years. And when people have asked me right through my life as a professional botanist, as an ecologist, how frequently should the bush be burnt? I've said that in my opinion, 15 years is about the lower limit of what's able to be tolerated, what we call tolerable fire intervals for vegetation and for the plants and animals within it. And then the upper limit could be up to about 45, even 50 years. But to me personally, I think for the kind of bush that I grew up in this area, this Nillumbik kind of landscape, I would say somewhere around 35 years would be a reasonable figure. The length of time that I've lived in my current place of residence. And the place where I grew up, which has not had a fire since 1969, we're now talking about a period that hasn't burned, if you count it up, almost 50 years. So there we've come to the point where I think it's now getting too long in the tooth, but other places that have been burnt again and again and again, and with a creeping fire frequencies, intensities and landscape scale that is now being pushed on by human activity and in particular by climate change, which we are all collectively responsible for. And on top of that, throwing into that mix and it's a bit like putting petrol onto a fire, we're throwing into that mix our fire management activities, including fuel reduction burning, which is such a hugely controversial topic that you only have to mention the word fire, fire management, fuel reduction burning, and you'll ignite a community debate, a scientific debate, and a debate in authorities, agencies all over the country, and indeed all over the world, as the more and more of the most flammable parts of the world are gripped by fires that are beyond anyone's control. We've seen that in Australia this year. We've seen it in Western USA. We've seen it in Chile. We've seen it in Russia. We've seen it in the Mediterranean. We've seen it in places, even fires in Greenland. Would you believe that it's now possible to have fires in places that have probably not burnt for tens of thousands of years? So this issue of fire and the frequency of wildfires that we should aim for in our management, my feeling is I would give a figure of the 35 years I've lived in one place and no more than the 50 years that I've lived now almost continuously in North Wurundjeri or nearby. That to me is a span we should aim for, and everything we do in how we manage fire should be to bring back closer to the conditions of flammability and manageability. And in order to protect ourselves and all the assets that we take as so important, including the flora and fauna, we should be aiming for such frequencies of wildfire. Okay.
Yeah. Fantastic points, Dave. And that's where controversy does begin, with using science about frequencies in particular. As we move towards climate change, for Aboriginal people, it's not anything new. We have lived through climate change. We had a small ice age over 10,000 years ago, which changed the landscape. And we have creation stories about that and watching it happen. We have a creation story about the Yarra River, which has now been scientifically proven that we actually did watch the birth of the Yarra River. Or we had intimate knowledge of it. We have creations, well, sorry, the Bunurong people, my southern neighbours, have the creation story of Port Phillip Bay, watching it fill up. We have survived many, many catastrophes in the time that we've been in this land. It was only a discovery about 5 years ago down in Warrnambool that actually shows Aboriginal occupation here in Victoria, not 70,000 years as people think, but actually 120,000 years. Now, in that time, we actually became the first scientists. What we actually did is exactly what David Cameron spoke about, and that is we went out and we collected data. We documented everything, and we took it back to our university professors, who were our elders, who then analysed the information that we brought back to them daily in our normal work, where we walked around, observed the trees and the birds and the animals and the grasses, observed soil moisture and ant activity. During the night, we watched the bats that are flying around, and we took all that information, just like a research assistant would do, back to our elders who would analyse it. And they would say to us, well, did you notice while you're out there, did you see such and such a plant? Or did you see such and such a bird? Or was such and such a fish in the water? And if it wasn't there, that was an indicator to us that there was something wrong in the landscape. The elders would then analyse that, and then the next day, the next week, the next season maybe, or maybe the next year, would then send us out to what we call applying medicine to the land. Now, the smoking that I just did this morning was one very important part of that. Because fire actually does live in the land, in the Australian landscape, is that rather than fighting fire and running from fire and becoming fearful of fire, we learned to actually live with fire. And it became our main land management tool, not only for our personal safety, but also for the protection of the assets that we needed for our survival. And those assets are the country itself. Because in this country, we have a supermarket, we have a chemist, we have everything that we needed within the landscape to maintain our communities. So that was our food, our shelter, our clothing, our medicines. So the way that we applied fire is slightly different. Well, it's a lot different to what we call fire management today. We are getting asked all the time to join the firefighting forces. And many Aboriginal people do. But we were never firefighters, we were fire managers. Now, we haven't applied fire in this landscape right here where we're standing today, although we have been working closely with Brad Tadday from Nillumbik Shire on how we would apply fire in this landscape to heal it. Because even though looking around, it looks nice and green today, during the summertime, we know that there is a huge bushfire risk, and there hasn't been a fire through here for a long time. So every year we wait, the fire gets more and more intense. But we didn't do it for fuel reduction. Fuel reduction is a byproduct of fire management for healing country. We burnt to actually promote healthy structures, not just for us, but for all the animals, birds, insects, reptiles, and also our water quality, to maintain all of that in a healthy state. And to do that, you can't do it every 5 years or every 10 years or every 15 years. You burn it when country actually tells you that it's the right time to burn. Anybody can light a fire. We have all the modern methodology to use accelerated fuels to start a fire. But country will tell you when it needs the right fire. It'll tell you when it's sick, and it'll tell you the medicine, the right fire. There is no one fire, which is a common concept of go out and burn it because it's too dangerous. There are many different fires that are applied at many different times of the year, depending on the country that you're in. So just for me, not being a botanist, but where we're standing today is box country. That's the first thing I need to know when I'm doing a fire assessment. It's box country. Now in box country, I should expect to find certain types of grasses. And this is where I work very closely with the scientists to tell me what grasses are found under box trees. I should expect to hear, and we are hearing plenty of birds today, but as I walk down closer into the valley, I should be starting to hear frogs. If I don't hear those right things, that tells me it's sick. So then I have to start thinking about assessing when did I do the burn. Now, we get asked to do burns, and they expect immediate results, that everything's going to go back to being 100% full biodiversity. That won't happen in this day and age. Aboriginal fire has been missing out of the landscape since 1850, since the gold rush. That was when there was a huge concentrated effort to move Aboriginal people off their land by whatever means available. Our knowledge of the land was ignored. And I'll say this, that if they had asked us when Captain Cook first arrived here, why did we burn when we burnt, we would have a much better understanding of fire management in the landscape then as we would now, and we would not be having the catastrophic bushfires that we are having. So frequency is one that is always going to be debated, because my rule of thumb is you burn every year. Once you take over using fire management as a tool, you burn every year until it is back into a state of health. But every year you reassess it to see what kind of burn you put through. So you may have heard about cool burning, low intensity burning. These are all names that have been given by science. It's just right fire for right country at the right time. Now, not everybody can do that, and even I can't burn in all types of country. I'm only qualified from my elders to burn in certain types of country. And unfortunately, so far, I'm only qualified to burn in what is sick country. And over time, I would learn to apply fire into healthy country. We have much more senior elders than me that have much more knowledge in these fire systems. So we're going to take a little bit of a walk now and just walk through, and me and Dave are just going to talk to each other about what we're observing and what we're seeing. And through that, at the end of our hour, I hope that we can have an assessment process to understand from each other about applying a burn. Now, if we get the opportunity and I find the right place with my assessment method, I actually have a permit today to actually burn a small area, about 5 metres, 5 metres by 5 metres square, if it's going to light and if I think it needs it. But I probably will just do a demonstration anyway to show you what a cool fire actually is, how safe it is to us as humans, and how safe it is to the landscape. So we're going to start walking now. And first off, we're going to go to something else we've been trying to do here. So the one thing that's missing out of this place is food. There's plenty of medicine in the trees. There's not a lot of grasses here, although they're starting to look good at this time of the year. But the one thing that's not here is the food that our people would normally find in abundance in this area. So about 5 years ago, my small land management team called the Narrap team came here. We claimed a little bit of land with the permission of Nillumbik, and we planted some of our traditional foods. And hopefully over time, they will spread through this small reserve, and people will be able to come and collect the foods that should naturally be occurring in this bush. Now, they won't occur just by planting. Planting is a great thing to do. It's a great social activity, get people together, get them to understand the bush that they're living in, and people can have a chat and kids can run around and play, and that's all a great thing. But it should be just occurring naturally anyway, rather than forcing the land to give up its nutrients to support us. It's about working with the land to allow it to give what it is capable of giving, rather than trying to put fertilisers down and all these other methods, the modern methods that we have, which has actually slowly been destroying the country. But let's take our little walk. Now, for all of you, we've been talking for a little while now. If you have any questions on the Q&A thing, and put them in, and there happens to be quite a few of you asking the one question, hopefully our hosts in the background that are sitting in their lounge rooms will gather them, and they can interrupt us at any time to talk about what we're observing or what you may want some clarification on. So look at this one tree that we've got here.
Yeah, I'm on.
Uncle Dave, yep.
It's Penelope here. We've had a couple of questions about how do cultural burns fit in with really remnant pockets of endangered plants? Like what if they get to the bottom of the roots of an orchid, for instance, or how do you know?
Yep, that's a very good question. So one of the things that happens when we start talking about doing burning is you do have your, and I call them mad orchid lovers, And they're very, very, very protective of them. And I don't blame them, because they are getting more rare and threatened all the time. And we do take that into account. Now, when we do a burn, we don't burn and leave a whole blackened landscape. We assess the right time to do the burn so that the things that do not require fire do not actually get burnt. Now, to do that, you actually have to understand how water moves through the landscape. Now, water just doesn't always come down in a great big sheet down across this whole landscape that we're looking at now. It does actually move in and out, down in the lower parts of the land. I'm not talking about the big gullies. I'm talking about any piece of land. Even a flat piece of land is not flat if you put water on it. It will move around, and that's actually how you want fire to move through the landscape as well. So when we choose an area to burn, we've designated a time, we've done our labour, our prep before we light the burn, we've worked out where we're going to light it, we've worked out where it's going to finish without having to have fire trucks there to put it out. We would never burn more than 50% within the area that we've designated to burn, because it will be green, half green. We would only burn half of it, and the other half would stay green. And that other half is where your rare and threatened plants will be. It's also where your rare and threatened insects, ants, ant colonies. It'll burn around different types of soil within the landscape, depending on how much soil moisture they have, which tells you the different heats of the intensity of the one fire that you're putting through, and it will react in different parts of the landscape. But also, it'll have vegetation left for all the animals that do get disturbed by fire, for them able to move straight back into the system. Whereas the modern method of fire management is to burn everything down, except the trees, and leave this blackened landscape, which takes so much more time to recover. It is the assessment process and the application process is just as complicated as fire operation planning from forest fire management today. It's just that we approach it in a different way. I hope that answers your question for whoever that was. We can talk about a bit more at the end.
Maybe I can add a little bit of my interpretation to the answer to that question. As an ecologist and as a botanist, the key issue that we need to address when we talk about the impact that fire might have on rare or threatened plants, in this case because of the mention of orchids, the key issue we need to ask is, at the time of European settlement, which of course was not the original settlement, under pre-European, which means Aboriginal time conditions, we need to ask the question, what was the equilibrium between Aboriginal life and activity and management of the landscape and the prevailing climate at the time, the weather patterns in their cycling, and the flora and the fauna. And what we need to try to understand is what was the equilibrium between those interacting forces which allowed all of those plants and animals to stay in place or move around within those communities. Because my ecological answer to that question is, I would try and tap myself on the shoulder to say, what do I think and how much can I learn from other people? How much these days can we learn from Aboriginal memory and documentation? Unfortunately, so much of it is now only available, particularly in Southern Australia, from the early reports of often those German observers, the people who like to document, write things down and make great treatises out of their observations. Wherever that information is available to be put together in a modern day sense, we need to ask the question, those plants, those animals were there because there was an equilibrium between fire intensity, fire frequency, the landscape scale, the season of fire, and what Aboriginals had been doing in that landscape for thousands of years, adjusting and adapting to the ever-changing climate, which usually changed in quite short periods quite dramatically and then settled into a new equilibrium. Because the point I would make is those orchids, those other plants, those animals were there only because they were adapted to that particular equilibrium. And so what we aim to do as ecologists, this is not necessarily what all agencies aim for, because they've got a range of different responsibilities and commitments, but in the background should be this ecological knowledge, these days increasingly asking the question, what do the Aboriginal elders and other practitioners of what they once used to do have to say about their contribution to fire management at the time of European settlement, and putting all those things into a mix, say, well, what are the conditions today? What can still be done? What has to be adapted to the new conditions, taking into account the weeds that have arrived, the pest animals that have arrived, the diseases that have arrived, and the fact that we have done untold, dastardly things to the landscape. And if I look around this bit of bush right here, as we walk, you'll notice that it's not remotely actually a flat landscape. It is actually the result of an enormous upheaval that took place in the time of the gold rush in the 1850s, which is a period where Dave said, Uncle Dave said earlier, this important thing, that was when Aboriginals were largely evicted from their lands and their Aboriginal land management practices ceased and were replaced by a new set of imperatives, which was green pick for graziers, timber for the mills, timber for the fire stacks, timber for the mining industry and all its different
bread industry
forms.
was the biggest one.
And yes, and from this area around here, a lot of the best timber that was cut was the box timber, which was absolutely the most desirable fuel to feed into the kilns and into the fires that produce the bread and cook the bricks and all the rest of it for our modern day civilization. And so my answer to the question is, you've got to look around and see what was it that maintained those plants and animals in the landscape, including the frequency, the intensity, and the nature of that fire. And when I talk about orchids, I point out, or I need to explain to those who are worried about fire burning into the orchid roots and so on, orchids actually, in many cases, relied on a fairly consistent frequency of fire in most landscapes in order to flower most profusely, to produce the maximum amount of seed production and seed set, in order that they can maintain their populations. But they were almost never actually eliminated by fire. In fact, there are some species, there's one particular well-known orchid to orchid specialists, Burnetia cuneata, which lives in thickets in eastern Victoria, which require fire to even flower. They will not be capable of flowering until a fire, and it's an absolutely intense conflagration, which burns their particular habitat, a dense, moist thicket of melaleucas and related species. And so this interrelationship between fire and flowering and seed production is so terribly important that if you go for too long, as I said, we're now really up to the end of what is a tolerable fire interval at the upper end of the scale. When people talk about tolerable fire intervals for plants and animals, particularly for plants, they mostly think we're talking about the lower limit. That's very important, because if we burn too often, and these days that happens for any number of reasons, climate change is now the greatest contribution to increasing frequency of very intense fires, often in the wrong season, because now fire seasons are spreading across most months of the year in various parts of Australia, something unheard of at the time of European settlement. What's happening today is that we now have incendiary risk at so many different times of year that we're now looking at overfrequent fire as the greatest risk to many, many plants and animals. But there's another risk, and that is insufficient frequency of fire. And in some environments, if you can't clear some of the dense stocking rates of things like kangaroo grass on the kangaroo grass dominated woodlands and grasslands, say in Western Victoria, but that species, kangaroo grass, is right here in this community as well. If we get too great a density of certain species, then things like orchids, whilst they're not eliminated, they can't flower because they need that extra space. They need the nutrient hit that you get when you have what's called the ash bed effect. And that's actually created by fire of various intensities. And Aboriginals maintain that, particularly in those very fertile environments, very intentionally, very judiciously, and they contributed to the maintenance of orchids and lilies, many of which were important staples, food staples for them.
That's right. Most people don't realise that we did eat a lot of those orchids. No one would ever dig one up now. There's just not enough of them to even get a proper feed anyway, let alone feed your community. But yeah, it's very important about the frequency and intensity of the fires.
And the season, yes, the season of fire.
Intensity of fires are increasing. The period of time that they're happening are getting longer. And in actual fact, from my elders, having lived through, maybe not this intense, but having lived through these drier times, is actually the time to start burning more frequently, but actually at this time of the year. but much more smaller fires. It's not about burning this whole gully that we're looking at. It's about applying lots and lots of small fires for the different communities, the grass communities that are in here, to create the one scientific word I do like to use, which is intertussic spaces, to allow the flourishing of the biodiversity. Yeah.
Uncle Dave, sorry, it's Penelope here. Could you flip the camera so it's facing you guys?
Oh, okay.
We've had a few requests.
I think I can do that modern technology. Here we go.
Yeah. No, that's great.
You were going to talk about the wild fairy, the
Yes.
ballad.
That's up now. Yep, there we go.
There's been a lot.
What's it again?
There's
Wait a
been
minute.
more questions about. Oh no, flip it again.
Yep. Come on, flip. That's it.
Yeah,
Every time
We'll talk about this so we can keep moving through the sun.
Oh, there you go. Look, we're all starting to get cold standing here, so we're going to keep moving. We'll see more of these other trees in a minute.
There's been a lot more questions about soil health and fungi and you know, scientific studies and things like that. But I think you've been answering them as we go. So I think if you get moving into the sun, that's probably a nice thing.
That's much better.
Yeah.
Much better.
Yeah, soil health is very important in when you're applying fires. So when I look at this, and it's predominantly box country, that's usually the first burn of the year that we would do. And as you move into stringy bark country, that's a little bit later. And when you get into your actual eucalypt gums is the last one that you burn, because they're usually lower down where it's much wetter. And you'll see that the reason those trees grow in those particular areas is because of the geology of the soil. Now, this was all known to us. And different soils, of course, hold different heat when fire is applied to them. So lighter soils don't hold heat as much, blacker soils do. And you'll find your blacker soils down in the lower parts of your gully. Actually, I've got to try and remember, no, we're actually around this way. While I'm talking, I'm forgetting where I'm walking. We're going to walk down to our little, not our orchid patch, but our food patch. Yeah, these are very important things that we do know. So soil moisture when you apply the fire is very, very important, so you don't get too much depth and damage that, what do they call it, mycorrhizal fungi.
Yep. And destroy the humus.
Yep, and destroy the humus as well. It is only about cleaning your forest floor or even your grassland floor. It's not about getting intense fires into there. It's enough to create those spaces that allows the biodiversity to flourish. But yeah, very important parts of the assessment process.
If I can make a comment about this issue of soil, I mentioned in passing before, but if you walk around this particular bush reserve and many other areas in this district, from what is now called St Andrews, was once Queenstown, and Queenstown and nearby Wurundjeri, we're actually amongst the very first. In fact, Wurundjeri claims to be the first place where gold was found in the gold rush period. And once the prospectors arrived and people were cutting their way into the ground in all sorts of different ways and into the riverbeds and with deep mining, the turnover of soil was probably the most important opportunity for weed species from overseas, from every part of the world, but particularly originally from Europe, to take advantage of all this new soil at depth, rock, clay, rubble that was exposed, and that's all over this landscape. So what we're doing was we're replacing that very delicate balance between the humus layer, the topsoil, the different horizons in the soil, and we were just blanketing the landscape with material out of the mines, out of the pits that were dug everywhere, and there's lots of those all around the bush just around here. And that immediately allowed weeds from overseas to flourish in that disturbed environment. And that was the first big insult to this landscape since European settlement. The soil disturbance, alongside the lack of Aboriginal burning and other practices, which meant that we've now got the legacy of European weeds, and more than half the species on my property list are exotics from every part of the world, and I can point to almost every continent and region and say, well, there's a plant from South Africa, and there's one from South America, there's one from North America, there's many from China, many from the Himalayas, many, many, many from Eurasia, from the Mediterranean, all over the world. Those weeds have congregated here, beginning in the gold rush era with those massive landscape upheavals where soil at depth was spread over the surface and changing completely the interrelationship between herbivory, that means the eating of animal parts by the native fauna, the replacement of them by hard-hoofed animals, so horses, sheep, cows, and eventually today we have wild horses and we have samba and other deer. And they are causing untold havoc. And the pigs are even worse because they actually excavate the wet areas in their search for the very same things that the Aboriginals relied on as staples. So the pigs are digging the landscape up, but doing it in such an unruly fashion that it's actually destroying some of the most fragile wetland communities that we have left. And they're amongst the most fragile communities of all, and they were amongst the most important for Aboriginal communities because they provided the staples. Whether you could get animals or not, you always had the women, you had the women and you had the girls out collecting that material. There would always be some sustenance from the ground because fire management ensured that there was continuity within those moister soils, particularly the wetlands, the surrounding damp grasslands, and the grasslands generally. They were the areas that were most intensely settled, apart from places where there was fish and eel traps and so on. The most intensely occupied lands in Australia, if they weren't around the coast, around estuaries, around lakes or along rivers, they were in these very fertile areas where the relationship between fire and those plants that we mentioned earlier, the orchids, the lilies, the things with tubers, in wetlands, in moist soils and in heavy clay soils, these were the ones that supported the most permanent settlements and the greatest densities of Aboriginal occupancy on this continent.
We've got a nice few comments from Uncle Ken in Bush, who runs bush repair over in Binham Bushland, private heritage forest. Do you know him, Uncle Dave?
No, it's not a name I'm familiar with.
He's watching and really enjoying this, and and I know you're just about to get to the yam daisies, and so it's more of a comment. But they've in their private heritage forest, they want to encourage more yam daisies and wallaby grass understory tussocks.
Yep.
Flashing and wildfires have shown very encouraging results. Any comments? It was more of a comment, but seeing as you're there in the yam daisies, do you want to talk about them?
Yeah, we're going to start looking at these now.
Great.
And I'll just turn the camera around.
Going to point down to this.
Here we go. So we got our little marker here that says can we still read it?
Yeah, so I've looked at this particular tag a couple of weeks ago, and I can explain that what these little tags now tell us is the modern scientific name, and sometimes they'll also tell us an out-of-date name because plant names scientifically keep changing. Of course, the Aboriginal names for these were never necessarily region-wide, but in different parts of the range, this particular plant that's still growing here where it was planted has been called Murnong or Murniong or various different interpretations of that name, and in other places there'll be different words used. But in scientific parlance, we used to call this Microceras scapidra, confused with the name lanceolata, and these days, and only a couple of years ago, my colleague Neville Walsh at the National Herbarium of Victoria finally worked out that the correct name for this plant, which is the most common and widespread of the yam daisies, is actually an old name where the scientific epithet for the species is Walteri. So we now call this technically Microceras or Microceras Walteri, but it's taken till several years ago, since the time of European settlement, to settle on the correct scientific name. Whereas Aboriginals have had their naming systems, they've known consistently for tens of thousands, many tens of thousands of years, what each of these plants was, what their particular role was in the landscape. And this plant is phenomenally important. And an old colleague of mine, Beth Gott, who's written many books about Aboriginal plants of commerce and cultural significance and economic plants, but particularly food plants, she pointed out years ago in a seminar that she gave that I attended, that there were a number of different entities within what we call blithely the same thing. We call them yam daisy. And she said, well, they're very different in the Alps to what they are on the plains, to what they are more widely. and it's taken science years to catch up. And she even pointed out something we don't yet have fully documented. She said that up at Mount Sterling, there was an alpine population which had a different root system to all the others. And even to this day, that is not yet scientifically correctly named. There is no name yet for the particular version that occurs around Mount Sterling, which Beth Gott was aware of decades ago. So what I'm saying is we are playing scientific catch-up to what has been so well known to Aboriginals who knew exactly which were the special characteristics of the yam daisies on the heavy soil plains that I just said are so important for, or they were at the time of settlement for Aboriginals. They became ultra significant for the graziers because that was Australia Felix, as Thomas Mitchell in 1836 proclaimed that this was the most felicitous, meaning the most enduring place to support human populations. That's what he envisaged as a European settler and explorer. He wanted to call that Australia Felix because felicity or Felix, that word is a Latin word, means very kindly in its ability to support and care for and reciprocate between what's around you and human occupancy. But of course, that was nothing new because that had been already what Aboriginals had done for at least 60,000 years, potentially up to twice that long. We're not too sure about that upper figure yet.
Yeah,
but I want to point out
one thing. So it's nice to know all the names of all the plants because knowledge is a very powerful thing. But for Aboriginal people, it's knowing where our food should naturally occur. Now, a lot of the early Aboriginal protectorates tried to name the plants by trying to talk to us, but basically they just put them all down as yams without actually knowing what their name is. But the Murnong was the most popular one, the most prolific one, and it was like today's potato, or for the Asian people, for the rice. But CSIRO has actually taken these Murnong plants and tested them, and they've actually found for the space that's needed, the nutrients that they need, the water that they need to grow, it's actually a much more efficient plant within the Australian landscape than it is than growing your Talangi potatoes. And these are the important things. These are the important things that we need to look at as we go in towards climate change, that we should be looking, instead of trying to promote better wheat and better irrigation systems as we get lower and lower on water, that we should be looking at these native foods because they sustained Aboriginal people for thousands and thousands of years. And in early reports, we're all very healthy specimens. We had a varied diet. 70% of our diet was vegetarian, as Dave said, because if the kangaroo wasn't there, for whatever reason, the plants were always there. The Murnong was just one of many. And what we've got planted in this little area here, which I think is about 20 metres by 20 metres, now these have all been planted. There are chocolate lilies, there are vanilla lilies, we've got the native pelargonium, we've got microlina. Most people don't understand that microlina is actually a food as well. The seed, even though it's very small, is, we've got some Demeter grass there as well.
And here we've got a very nice big kangaroo grass, Demeter. Yep. These days we call it Demeter triandra. People believe that it's the same species from here to East Africa. I don't personally subscribe to that. My feeling is we'll one day go back to calling it Demeter australis, but for the time being, that's the name we have for this species. Of course, it's what we call kangaroo grass, and it's got the most beautiful, very distinctive seed heads. It's an unmistakable plant, and if you look at how tall and skinny that is
one of the tallest ones I've seen down here in Victoria. That's a common height in Queensland.
Yes.
Up around Cape York.
I've even seen what I think is the same species in the mountains of northern Philippines, where there are tribal cultures that are still living with much of their traditional land husbandry practices. I've done some ethnobotanical studies with that community, and on the slopes near their paddy fields and into their so-called scrublands and bushlands, and what's left of their rainforests, I saw none other than what I think is exactly the same species. So it circles around, whether it's the same thing all the way or not, from Australia up through Southeast Asia and eventually through to East Africa, which is where we regard this as the same species. But if you look at the tussock, Dave, let's talk about the significance of this dense tussock. I don't know if you can get the scale of that, or if you look at this example here, Dave was mentioning before a very profound thing. It was this, what he said was a scientific concept that he likes to use the same term for, that is intertussock space. Now, if you look at the intertussock space between this tussock here, this next smaller one here, the bigger one there, there's actually plenty of space, and there's a bit of litter there, and there's lots of tiny, tiny things growing. Dave, can you focus that? Can you see you've got a little native Veronica? We've got that same little Veronica there. We've got little seedlings that looks like a eucalypt seedling there. I'm not sure if it is, but whatever it is, these things are, and there's some mosses, very important parts of the landscape. In this case, there is actually is a garden of about 3 or 4 different moss species I can identify just there under my, under the area of my fingernail. There'd be 3 different moss species jostling for space, and some of them are beginning to put their capsules up. Now, when you look at this community, you can see clearly that that's not going to be able to survive under the tussock itself. So once these kangaroo grasses and other tussock grasses, and there are many, many tussock grasses in our flora, once they get too dense, there is no intertussock space for the mosses, for the litter accumulation to turn to soil, and for germination of new plants. That mightn't matter for many of them because they survive a very long time, but there are others for which it's critical, and they can only survive, particularly small annuals, short-lived things. They need those intertussock spaces. And an important part of pre-Aboriginal landscapes was that there would have been lightning-strike fires that would have maintained some kind of natural frequency in equilibrium with that climate and that landscape, which allowed these things to evolve. Once Aboriginals were on the scene, they actually pushed this a little bit in their favour. So they were land managers, actually altering the relationships enough that they were able to not remove or eliminate species, but actually favour a proportion that were important for their own survival and for their own kitchen. And so
maintaining the balance.
They were maintaining a new balance. And the moment European settlers pushed them off Australia Felix and the rest of the Australian landscapes where they have been moved off, particularly around the period of the gold rush when we talk about Victorian settlement patterns, European settlement patterns, what immediately started to happen was that a lot of these grasslands that needed these intertussock spaces failed to get traditional burning practices happening, and so it relied entirely on graziers fires, often escaped fires, accidental fires, which actually people often overlook the incendiary nature of human activity. So a lot of them are actually intentionally lit fires. We call it arson. It can be done for all kinds of reasons. And then, of course, there are the lightning strikes that continue to support a proportion of our fires. And in forest areas, that's often thought to be the major ignition point. But notwithstanding all of that, what I'm trying to point out is that there is this very important balance maintained by all the different sources of ignition, the natural build-up of fuel rates, and particularly the fuels that are accumulated under and around the tussocks themselves of these terribly important native grasses. And so by maintaining some judicious frequency of fire at whatever scale, and Dave's explained repeatedly that it was a very carefully managed small-scale fire with a lot of areas unburnt, and where it never was so intense that it would burn into peats and set off peat fires, and it would never burn all of the growing soil.
The right time of the year to burn this would not actually damage those mosses.
And that's a profound thing, because even the imposed fires that we call fuel reduction burns these days will do that damage. And so we lose the capacity for these intertussock spaces to maintain the balance of small things and different things, that all the invertebrates, that is all the insects and so on, and of course all the larger things, the things that need to germinate from seed in these intertussock spaces. We actually push that balance in various directions, but it's not always maintaining the original complement of species or even the modified complement that we've ended up with today. So when we're looking here at these intertussock spaces, this is a very important part of this sequence of events. Now, this little garden, I should say, has been called the Food, Fibre and Medicine Garden. And so one of the plants that exemplifies the issue of fibre is this look at plants here. By the look of it, some of them were planted, but others are now quite wild.
Natural.
This is actually a wild native flax. We call this Linum marginale. Linum is the Latin name for the flax of commerce. But this is a native species. So this is Linum marginale, native flax. And here it is with its seed pods from last year. It's growing up, it will flower again, and it's quite a big established individual. If you look at the base of that, that's quite a well-established large individual.
You can see how solid that is. When I apply fire in this landscape, that actually will tolerate fire quite well with that solid trunk base. You might burn some of this off, but that will actually come back quite easily. But we would manage this particularly.
So there's another,
an
example of a fibre plant.
Yeah, it's growing all the way through just one side here. But going back to here, we burnt this garden 4 years ago, I think it was, and left it quite open. And the next year we had quite a lot of our tuberous plants come back. But if we was allowed, this is overdue for a burn, because this will start to take over and it'll spread right through. Plus we've got a lot of weedy grasses in here as well.
So this is now last year's seasonal growth.
Yeah.
Breeza maxima. There's also another one called Breeza minor. These are two of the most pernicious annual European, in this case, weedy grasses. And when I said that we turned this landscape over at the time of the gold rush, and if you were to point up there, you'd see how uneven the ground is, with hollows where there were prospectors looking for gold, and that immediately gave rise to the first massive introduction of weedy plants into this landscape. In the grasslands, the Australia Felix grasslands, that started pretty soon on the heels of Thomas Mitchell. Major Thomas Mitchell is the first European explorer to set his eyes on those magnificent lands that were so well populated by Aboriginals across Western Victoria. It was very soon after that that the graziers brought enormous numbers of stock, cattle, sheep, and of course their own horses and oxen. And they transformed that, and it took as little as a decade to largely replace a lot of the native plants, particularly the native grasses, with exotic grasses. But when we get to these landscapes like what we call the Nillumbik landscape, the Silurian sediments northeast of Melbourne, particularly the area that the Yarra takes its tortuous pass through, in this environment, Breeza maxima alone is one of the most dominant replacement weeds that's now creating very fast, flashy fuels because it's an annual. It's coming up everywhere. Most of the green we see out here in the landscape is actually exotic weedy grasses. There's relatively much less of the native grasses like the weeping grass, Microlina stipoides, which actually happens to be the most common grass within this little garden bed. So this area is filled with this native grass. It's a very important species.
This one here.
Can I interrupt while you're on the Microlina? There's been a question about Uncle Dave. You were talking about the seeds before of Microlina food source.
Yeah, it's actually it's a native rice.
Yeah, right.
We actually used this and treated it the same as you would a rice, and all it needed was hot water, not boiling water. So it was dried, stored in very rough earthenware jugs, which that's only new information from Bruce Pascoe's research, and it's in Thomas Mitchell's books that we did actually collect this seed and the Themata seed, the kangaroo grass seed, which was used for making bread. Now, even though this is a very, very small seed on this Microlina here, there are many, many types of Microlina. And there was some work done quite a few years ago by a bloke named Ian Shivers. Do you remember him?
Not personally, no.
Okay, so he did some study into Microlina and did some crossbreeding of various Microlinas across Victoria to try and get one that would prove to be commercially beneficial to replace the introduced rice that we got, because it doesn't require anywhere near the amount of water for Microlinas to grow. In fact, it is still quite a common grass, but unfortunately, Australia looks at it as lawn seed and nothing else. They don't actually look at it as a food.
Can I get you to focus on just this area to make a point I'd like to make here? This is a native grass. It's a perennial. Technically and botanically, we've had the misfortune of treating it as one species ever since European identification. We've simply called it Microlina stipoides. The truth is that I know of at least 3 different forms that act in very different ways. One's quite an aggressive weed that's often carried with black sands that are used to to backfill into trenching for services. You know, when you trench alongside a road or into your backyard, often there's this black soil that in the Melbourne context comes from the southeastern sandbelt. And that often seems to introduce one different, very vigorous, but quite slender, tall green form. I'm also quite familiar with a grey form that's more common in sclerophyll bush, that is the sort of bush we've got around here. And then in grasslands and other areas, we have the form that we're looking at here, which is really green and stays green. They all do. They're all perennial and green. And on my own property, I go out of my way to never disturb this when I'm doing my annual fuel cleanup. I never want to disturb it because that will allow it to be replaced by weedy grasses, and I don't want that. And this remains a green turf, and I've often used the phrase marsupial lawn grass or marsupial lawns for places where the marsupials, particularly in our case, black wallabies, swamp wallabies, will come out of the bush and they'll graze on these. They're literally grazing, and they'll graze it down and keep this close, low turf. And then that gives way to various other things back into the shrubbery around these little openings within the forest, particularly in damp areas, where the kangaroos and the wallabies will come out and graze the microlina lawn, and they'll maintain this well-cropped lawn, which each season throws up these inflorescences with the abundance of seed on them.
Yep.
But science has actually yet to catch up with the need to identify these different forms, and that person Chivers that Dave just mentioned did that work to try to isolate what was going on with different forms. We have yet to actually identify taxonomically whether we have one or a number of different varieties, subspecies, ecotypes, or even good species within this terribly important plant, which is one of our most important native grasses that hangs on despite an enormous amount of change in herbivory patterns, change in landscape management, change in fire management, and even weed invasion. It's one of the most important native grasses in its ability to hang on, even when a lot of other things have disappeared or changed. Yep. I take my hat off to it, and I treasure it on my own property. I will not let anyone force me to manage it in any other way. I will not go and slash it, because then I end up with weedy grasses that die off and create a fire risk that I don't want.
Yep.
So I keep it because it's green throughout the year.
Can I interrupt again? Sorry.
Yep.
Partly because we've actually only got 5 minutes to go. But it might be that you want to keep going. There've been lots of questions. There have been lots of questions about people wanting to grow some food plants at home, and is it appropriate culturally? And is it also appropriate to have Murnong daisies from a different part of Victoria in this part of Victoria? And, you know, what do you guys think about?
Okay, so there's lots of discussions going on at the moment about intellectual property of particular food plants, and especially medicine and pharmaceutical plants. And there's a couple of sessions I've got to attend next week on it, actually, about how we do that. Now, Murnong did occur all up and down the eastern coast of Australia, and all the way across to southern Australia through the greater western plains grasslands. So you can grow it anywhere. I encourage people to grow it. It's very difficult to grow in the soil. It's much easier to grow in pots. And in fact, on the Merri Creek Management Committee, and we talked about accidental fires before, Dave, a lot of the Merri Creek grasslands that are left are preserved through accidental burning by young kids nicking off from school.
Having a smoke.
Yeah, having a smoke or doing whatever they're doing, a little campfire, and off it went. And that actually preserved the grasslands that we have today. And there's very good records that used to be, at the right time of the year, a field of yellow because it was all Murnong. I got no objections to people growing it. I do have objections to people wanting to commercialise it and sell it for money, because I can tell you now that on my little property of 200 acres in Hillsville, I'm now in the process, which is why I'm going through the intellectual property, is to actually start growing it commercially for the benefit of my community, the Wurundjeri community. So if people want to buy Murnong in the Yarra Ranges or in Wurundjeri country, it'll be done through the Aboriginal co-op so that we can have some economic benefit. Because the one thing that people don't realise Yes, Aboriginal people are fighting for land. We get land back, but usually because of its significance of its sacred site, for whether it be because there's burials or there's artefact scatters, we're not actually allowed to develop it. That's a really strange thing. The 200 acres I do have, there is some areas reserved where we will not ever dig up or plant, but we have areas identified where we can, and we're now going to start finally making some commercial gain out of the land that we got back. So grow it for yourself for your own personal use. It's just like, you're not going to outdo Coles if you grow your own carrots and cauliflowers and lettuces. But yeah, I encourage people to, if they can find the plants, and there are nurseries that do sell them, to grow them for your own personal use, and you'll find, I think you'll find there's some of them are a challenge to your taste buds. Myself personally, I don't like Murnong. It's quite bitter. If I'm going to grow native foods for me that I want to eat all the time, it's the bulbine lily. The bulbine lily, to me, just think of your grandmother's best mash, and that's what a bulbine lily is. But it's all the way that you cook them. You also have to be careful when you're cooking them that you cook them right. The one thing about native plants, Australia does have higher arsenic concentrate in the soils than any other country. And if you don't cook them right, you can actually make yourself sick. Not enough to kill you, but it can actually make you sick. So be careful about what you're doing. Oh, you want me to turn around again? Sorry, I could see that I'm there on the other main screen. Yeah.
I'll just add another comment to the issue of Murnong. There is a little place to the northwest of Melbourne on one of the highways leading out of Melbourne. You go through this place called Murnong. It's actually
Murnong, I think it's called.
Murnong. It's actually named for the most important plant across those plains. But I've driven through there and glanced at the roadside, and I'm convinced that you would struggle to find a single native plant at Murnong on the roadsides and into the paddocks, let alone fields of yellow when they're flowering. So what's quite ironic and quite an astonishing thing is that we've named a place for a plant that is now totally extinguished from that landscape. And in fact, of the currently named species of yam daisy, the species of Microceras, one of them is so literally threatened that it's now one of our most threatened species on our threatened species list. And that species was once abundant across the plains. It is the most threatened of our three species. We've got another one that's an alpine species, and then we've got the widespread one that's now finally got settled down to its correct name, which is Microceras walteri. But that one has different forms, so that there's a quite distinct form up in the Mallee country on deep sands. I've seen that one. I've seen that, what I think is the same form in the Little Desert. But there are different forms of that one. And as I said, Bethgott was aware decades ago of a distinct form where the root system was different again at Mount Sterling up in the Alps. So there's a long way to go in taxonomically working out what they are. So I would caution just picking up any old Murnong that's in a pot in some sort of nursery without asking, where did this come from? Ask the question of what's called provenance. What is the source? And it would be ideal to try to use the form that belongs to your landscape or your particular local area, because otherwise you will be planting one that might be needing to be on the plains or needing to be in the Alps or needing to be on a sand dune, and you've got the wrong one. That's a waste of time. It's pointless. So provenance, whether we've got the right name on it or not, will always give you the right version.
Yeah. So if you go to the proper native nurseries,
ask for local provenance.
Yeah, ask for the local provenance, and basically, if you've got a native nursery near you, they normally have their own code of ethics where they only collect seed from the area, so you're pretty much guaranteed to get the right stuff. But there is exchange of seeds between native nurseries. But get to know your native nursery really well. So yeah, you let them know you trust them. That way, they trust you that you're actually doing the right thing. It's a complicated issue because I hear that Bunnings in Preston is actually selling Murnong. And they're probably, I don't know, it's the only one I know that is selling it. And I haven't gone to check it out to see if it's true yet. But yeah, once that happens, then you have all different forms of plants coming out, but they're not actually for eating. They're just because they look pretty. So if you look at things that we use for weaving, the lamandras, which is a fairly common plant. It's used in landscaping all over the place.
Example of a lamandra.
It's a filiformis, that one?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's a very, very, sorry, I have to turn my phone around again. This one here is fairly common throughout here, but it's only the filiformis. It's a very small one, a bit small for weaving.
Yeah, it's called the mattle watrush. The wattle, sorry, let me get it right. The wattle matrush. And this particular one is Lomandra filiformis. This would be probably called subspecies coriacea. But again, taxonomy is very slow to pick up. My colleagues and I recognise at least 3 different unnamed versions of this. And there was a study that's been done. I've been to the seminar, and they're looking at giving some decent names to some of the different truly distinctive subspecies of this. So we're slowly catching up on what has been traditional knowledge for tens of thousands of years.
That's what I keep saying. We're working towards the same goal, science and ancient knowledge, but we're just, learning to understand each other and doing. But what you'll find in Bunnings, you'll find so many different species of Lomandra, but they're all cultivars. So they're genetically engineered, not genetically engineered, they're modified to a way that's suited for landscaping, which means you don't get the seeds on them. And the seeds were an important part of our food base as well. A lot of the seeds that you think are common, but aren't now, can't actually be used for food. So there's a difficulty in buying native plants from these conglomerates, these gardening supply places. There was another one that I've seen before that I was going to point out. But Lomandra Dianella seed was combined with kangaroo grass seed as a basic flour for our breads. Now, this one I do know, because we are actually making kangaroo grass bread. And the last loaf that was made about 3 years ago, because of all the research that went into it, it cost $1,100 for a loaf of bread. But again, Shire done the tests on it, and they found out, they found out that 1 slice of kangaroo grass bread is equal to 4 slices of tip top in its nutritional value. It doesn't affect anybody who's gluten intolerant, doesn't affect anybody who's got celiac disease, according to the tests they've done so far. And yet here it is growing wild, and it can become a monoculture if it's not managed with fire, and it'll smother everything out. But if you look, and it requires, this is growing naturally. The only thing we've done is fence it off from too much browsing by wallabies. So it's growing outside the fence as well, but it's nowhere near at the health that we've got in here. But if we leave it like this, it will senesce on itself. It'll smother out everything else. So it needs management and it needs harvesting.
And we just...
I was going to say, it's midday, so if anyone needs to leave, your time is totally up. But we just wanted to ask if you have the time, if you want to do a sample burn, and if anyone wants to hang around for, say, another half hour, if that's, if you guys have got the time.
Look, as we've walked through, there's really nothing that is going to burn today. Okay. We had a whole heap of rain last night.
Almost half an inch.
Yeah, more than what the Weather Bureau predicted. But definitely this is one that I'm sure that the NARAP team is talking with Brad to come back and burn next year at the right time. And it won't be in the autumn. If it is, it'll be in very late autumn. So our burning window starts when forest fire management finishes. So from April onwards, all the way through to September is when we burn. So I can't burn here today, but I can guarantee you I can go to the same landscape, not so far away in Christmas Hills, but there'll be places to burn. 2 weeks ago, I was burning on the other side of Hillsville. Not so well forested as this, but just because you go out there and go, oh, I can't burn here, so you can't burn anywhere. That's the whole difference about forest fire management, or about fire management in general as a farming practice. Just because you can't burn here today doesn't mean you can't go somewhere else in this great landscape that we, as the traditional custodians, had responsibility to do that. It's why we didn't actually live in one particular place, because we needed to move across the landscape to actually manage it.
And there's...
And we've got one more thing. Yep.
Can I just add a little, my swan song story is to do with this little plant down here. I don't know if you can focus on that. With this little spiny, little spines. But there's an example of a bigger one.
Yeah, which is all through this place.
Yeah, it's a very common plant. This is Berseria spinosa, or sweet Berseria. This is a very interesting and important plant, despite it being so common, because in the Eltham area and some areas nearby, and as it happens also up near Bendigo and Castlemaine, and even in the little desert areas. This is the plant on which the Eltham copper butterfly is totally reliant, together with the activities of several species of ant. As far as I know, they're still undescribed, 2 different species of Notoncus. And so the butterfly larvae are entirely dependent on browsing on the foliage of this plant, but being protected at night, during the day, down underground in the galleries of the Notoncus ants. And the ants actually husband the larvae every night when birds can't get them up onto the plants and lead them to eat one branch at a time, strip them entirely clean. But because this is a resprouting plant that root suckers extensively over decades from the same, germinated individual, the mother plant, these things in the form that is important for the butterfly remain stunted because they are constantly being trimmed back by the butterfly larvae. And if you don't have the dwarf form kept dwarfed by this relationship between the Notoncus ants that have galleries around the root system of these root suckering plants and the plant itself, you will not have the maintenance of that highly threatened now, almost extinct butterfly. So the Eltham copper butterfly was described in the year of my birth by a colleague who died some years ago. In 1951, he named that particular butterfly. It was, the type population was the Green Hills area just outside Greensborough, which is now all built up. And once that had all gone to become residential country, the specialists thought that it was extinct. And then some years back during the 80s, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Michael Braby, who's now Australia's leading authority on butterflies, he was doing his PhD in the floor below me, and he rediscovered this Eltham copper butterfly now in the Eltham area. And he came to me and he said, he shook his head and he looked very gloomy. And I said, "What's up, Michael?" And he said, "Well, I've rediscovered this supposedly extinct butterfly, but tragically it's on land that's owned by some banks and it's going to be developed into effectively the Eltham Woods estate in the hills behind Eltham." And I said, "Well, have you talked to your supervisor, the very well-known entomologist Tim New?" And he said, "Yes, I have." And Tim just shakes his head and says, "Oh, that's tragic. We're going to lose it again. We thought it was extinct. Now we're going to watch it go extinct." And I said, "Well, we can't just stand here complaining about it." So I walked into the local member's office, Pauline Toner down in Eltham, walked into her office and started babbling on about threatened butterflies. And to her credit, she told the story later that people get into their offices, all kinds of people with crackpot complaints and ideas. And she said, well, one day the student came in, started babbling on about threatened butterflies, but to her credit, she took me seriously and she helped create a committee that looked into it. And eventually we found enough money from state sources and the local Shire and a lot of contributions from local artists to fundraise to actually buy 2 blocks of land from what became developed land. And they are still today the most important, thoroughly monitored populations of Eltham copper butterfly. And I've been involved in the monitoring of those sites ever since. And so this is a fascinating story because it's actually firstly, it's one of these iconic stories of the relationship between plants and animals that is so critical that if you lose any one of those particular elements, in this case, there's the bursaria, there's the landscape, there's the fire relations, that's very important to the community's health, is whatever the fire frequency is. And so we eventually had fuel reduction burns expressly, or ecological burns, in order to maintain the quality of the habitat for the butterflies and for the rest of the vegetation. Took a long time to get everybody to agree to it. It was very hard to do in the middle of the suburbs, but we did manage it. And the butterflies bounced back, the vegetation bounced back, and we didn't burn all of it, only a proportion of it. And so we did exactly what was the Aboriginal burning technique, burn part of it, but leave the rest as a refuge. And we've maintained those populations ever since. But it's also become a flagship for butterfly conservation, for invertebrate conservation. And to me, what's so important about this is that I actually made the suggestion at the beginning of that campaign that it didn't have a common name. I said, well, let's name it after the local area, because the Eltham area, rich with artists, rich with conservationists, a very green community, Let's get people to have a sense of local custodianship of something that's important to them, that's in their own area, where no one else in the world has this responsibility. Let's call it after the local area and call it the Eltham copper butterfly. And that helped to take, it really took off. It meant that there are all these different people locally pitching in, including the local parliamentarians. Cheryl Garbutt replaced Pauline Turner after she died in office, tragically. And so there's now what's called the Pauline Turner Butterfly Reserve, named after Pauline Turner, who did the right thing to actually listen to this strange young student babbling on about yet another weird idea. And so I think that this really is a very important example of the interaction between land management, all the elements that are required for the persistence of a highly threatened, highly dependent species, and just getting all of those things about management right.
Can I interrupt there, David Cameron? You might be pleased to know that Jane Toner, Pauline Toner's daughter, is listening in and just chatted and remarked that it was really good to hear that about her mother.
Yes, wonderful.
And a question for Dave Wandin. How do you find the bureaucracy with trying to work out the right time for cultural burns versus when the council wants to allow it, or other levels of government? Is wading through those bureaucratic issues a big deal?
Yep, I've been doing that now for 5 years. And there's always, the first question that gets thrown up is, where is your documentary evidence that supports that Aboriginal burning works? And I said, well, it's way back there prior to 1850. But it's actually written in the landscape if you know how to interpret it. And teaching people how to read the landscape to show where fire has gone through with good effects is very hard to do. So we need to go back to what the original scientific community of fire ecologists did after the, was it the 39 bushfires? Where they really started to look, where they first started to look at fire ecology. And the only way they could build up a scientific base or a documentary evidence was to go out there and do multiple trial burns over many, many years to be able to analyse it and then put it in a document. Now, that's exactly what the Aboriginal people want to do today, but there is a lot of bureaucracy to go through. It is getting easier and easier. So we're the first state, and I was a part of writing this document, to actually have an agreement with the state, so with DELP, on an Aboriginal or an Indigenous fire strategy, which says that the government must now work with communities who wish to. Not all Aboriginal communities do want to burn. Some of them, they're not confident in their knowledge. But DELP now is being told that they have to work with us if we require that we want to burn on public lands. Councils have actually been local councils have been very supportive. Nillumbik being, I think this was the first burn that I was allowed to do in Victoria, in this spot where I'm standing now. And it was very quickly, the red tape was gotten through in a few weeks. If I want to do a burn with DELP, it takes about 2 years for me to actually get it to happen. And there's a whole heap of red tape in Oc Health and Safety you go through. They want us, if we want to light fires, they say we must be trained firefighters. But if I'm a trained firefighter, it means I have no faith in my ability as a Aboriginal fire manager that the fire's going to get out of control. If I need to learn to fight a fire, that means I don't trust my knowledge. And that actually degrades the knowledge of Aboriginal people, not just me personally, but Aboriginal people in general, for the knowledge that they do have in the landscape. So there are lots of issues to get through yet. And I keep going back to Article 31 of the Human Rights Act, which says you cannot assimilate an Indigenous tribe by making them engage in modern occupations if it goes against cultural protocol. So, yep, there's a lot of issues. But 5 years ago when I started and said, yeah, I want to burn on country, the answer was flat out no. Now it's sit down, we'll talk about it. We do have some of our young people trained as firefighters. I'm still refusing to do the firefighting training to make sure that there are two methods of managing country. I'm not saying that we should go back to the Aboriginal way of burning. As Dave said before, there are too many introduced weeds. There's been too much ground disturbance. There's so many other factors where Aboriginal burning doesn't work in every landscape now. And it goes back to what I said at the smoking. We need combined methods of ancient knowledge, modern science, and slowly clear it up over time. But to build up that evidence, we need to put a lot more trials on the ground where not only Aboriginal people can study and learn, but the researchers can walk beside us, not dictating what we want, what we should be doing, just walking alongside us, recording the data, and then analysing it and using it for the best possible way for the future generations.
Thank you, Dave. Just got a general question
Yep.
for you about burning. Do you find that the accumulation of leaf litter is an issue on the landscape?
Yeah.
Particularly
It's the biggest thing in unhealthy, it's the biggest thing in preventing biodiversity without having your regular frequent fires of cleaning up. And that's all we ever did. When you get a landscape back into health, all you need to do is take off the grasses. So come summertime, you only need to burn off the grasses that will senesce from under here. You can see where last year's is. Let me do this. A lot more leaf litter, yeah. So all this here is left from last year. Some of it's rotted down, but you'll have all this next year. And it's just cleaning that up every year, cleaning up this little bit of leaf litter that keeps those spaces open. Oh, and I didn't turn my camera around.
I think you've got to turn it around.
Yeah.
Right?
It keeps reversing on me. Yeah. So this is all beautiful and green, but that'll dry off come autumn time. After it's all dropped its seed. Yeah, well, that's an even better one. Yeah.
That's a better illustration of the drying leaves. Eventually, that's what you'll have. 80% of the tussock will be that dry, accumulated material at the base.
Yeah. If you don't keep burning that, it does suppress all the growth of the weeds, growth of the other plants that you want to promote. So you got a spot to show me up here, Brad? Yeah, he's going to show me some leaf litter, a big build up of leaf litter. Sorry, I've left all the other camera people behind, but that's all right. Yeah, so when we come back and do some burning.
When do we know that it's too thick? And is that...
Yeah, this is not too bad. You can still see bare dirt in between it. So there's plenty of dirt spots in between here where you can see things that are still able to grow up. So, but it doesn't mean you don't burn it. Remember, you don't want to burn the whole landscape, but you can come into these deeper parts here where you can see that it's gathered and it's actually smothering everything down. Now, when this dries out,
the native orchids. These are...
There you go. We've got one orchid there. And this is where we do need to work together to make sure we've got our botanists to point out the things that I might not see. It's about working together. But you can actually, not now, it's way too wet underneath.
Yeah, this is the nodding greenwood. That'll flower.
Another edible plant, that one. Eating the bulbs out of that.
One of the most common of our orchids.
But when you've got leaf litter that's probably 6 leaves thick, across the landscape, that's when you'd start looking at burning them. And of course, immediately after a bushfire. The first year after a bushfire, all these leaves will be scorched when you've got an uncontrolled bushfire, and they will just carpet the ground. And you need to go in a year or two later. Here we go, we've got our little, insect catchers.
We've got a little insectivorous plant, a plant that makes up for the lack of nutrients in the soil. Yeah. This particular species of sundew. This one has large, white, very fragrant flowers. It's kept changing its Latin name. So don't worry about what the Latin name is necessarily. But this is a plant that's actually colonial, so it's got an underground rhizome that connects all of these. This is all one plant here. So there'll be hundreds of these little rosettes, as we call them, each producing one or several of these large, white, extremely fragrant flowers in spring. And that's an example of a species that's helping hold the soil together. Yep. What it's protecting is the more mature humus, the composting litter layer. But if you have too much litter, I suppose you could say that these larger leaves that are sitting on top are actually obscuring that. And so there's something there that, if you were to remove it, would actually give you access to the rest of the colony. And this is an instance where if you had a very low intensity fire, it might singe or burn off these rosettes, but they are produced annually. But the underground system will give you those back straight after the fire. So you're not actually damaging. It's like the question about the orchids that I said. Most of the orchids do perfectly well as long as the fire is not of the sort that will go deep into the soil and remove, in particular through heat, the very important fungi that are in the soil that they actually rely on. It turns out that most of our plants, in Australia in particular, because it's such an ancient continent with so much of its land having a low nutrient status, the mycorrhizal fungi are terribly important. It turns out that most of our trees and a lot of our native flora in the understory as well rely on that mycorrhizal relationship. And that's certainly the case for pretty much all of the dominant things that we're looking at in this bush. And if you have very intense fire, that will actually it will kill the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil and put at risk all the things that depend on it.
Yeah. So it's going back to the whole circle of living knowledge. And when you look at this bit of landscape here, you can see what looks like grasses up in the background, but it's not. It's all the Lamandra filiformis and very few tussock grasses.
Wallaby grass.
Oh, we got one there. Yeah, you've got a few, but you actually, if you put a fire through this, this one's dropping seed every year. But because of the leaf litter, it's probably not getting the chance to germinate.
Here we've got a spear grass.
Yeah.
So we've got all the major genera of native grasses here. We've got the kangaroo grass, we've got the weeping grass, the microlina, we've got the wallaby grass. I just gave you one example, but it's easily, you can easily find 5 to 10 species. In fact, right in there at Kew, Studley Park, virtually every species of wallaby grass in the entire Melbourne region was recorded within that tiny piece of bushland in the middle of metropolitan Melbourne, 5 million heading for 8 million or even 10 million people. In the middle of that, you can still find every single species of wallaby grass hanging on there in that little bush reserve. And so this bush here would have a good 5 or more different species of wallaby grass and several different species of spear grass. And so the diversity is there, but they're underrepresented.
That's right.
They're not the numbers, even if they're just hanging on.
Yeah. So you need to actually promote those, and without going out and planting them, fire is the one way to do it. A small, low intensity creeping fire along this floor here will actually do a world of wonders if the seed bank is still there on promoting more of these grasses without damaging the sundews. Here we go. Yeah.
Uncle Dave.
Yep.
Penelope again.
Can you point to that?
Been a few sort of cautionary tales about not trying this at home, boys and girls.
Fire-wise.
I can also promote weed growth as well. Does the NARRP team do private burns for people?
We do.
Or consultations?
Yeah, we do. Yeah. Most of our in-country fires is done through private property.
Yeah. Great.
I just want to point out one other example of an entirely different kingdom. In fact, this is an example of the interrelationship of 2 kingdoms. I don't know if you can see this. This is what looks like a little ordinary fungus. I'll just lift one of the caps up, and it's gilled. It's a gilled fungus. You can see it's got the gills, it's got the cap, it's got the stem, and it comes out of the ground like any ordinary fungus. But this is no ordinary fungus. This is actually an example of a lichen. And it's such an unusual lichen because these lichens are actually lichens where the fungal component is actually what we call a basidiomycete. That includes the guild fungi. There are many others. There's the pore fungi and so on. But this is a very unusual example of a lichenized guild fungus. And what the other component of that unique association between an alga in the algal kingdom, a green alga in fact, and the fungal component in the fungal kingdom. In this case, it's such an unusual component that we see here because the alga is actually this green slime that you can see on the surface. And then that combines with the fungus to produce this lichenized basidiomycete, which is a guild fungus. So it's a very unusual example But what's so important about this is that it's actually in areas where there's a lot of exposed clay soil. And a lot of this clay soil is the result of years and years of inappropriate management practices. We should not have so much exposed clay. A lot of it's because of that gold rush period, bringing a lot of clay soil to the surface, then it's spilling out and washing over, and then years and years of overgrazing by stock and a lot of clearing of the bush to provide timber for the furnaces and for the bakeries and for the mine shafts. So all of that happened here. We're looking at secondary forests. A lot of it's multi-stemmed eucalypts, showing that it's a young regrowth forest from massive disturbance in the past. And so there's far too much of this exposed soil without a proper litter layer and all the native plants we've been talking about and all the little sundews and everything else. And so this is a prime habitat for this particular lichenized basidiomycete fungus to actually help maintain the surface, because the surface is here protected by this green slime, which is the alga, and then we get these little fruiting bodies of the fungal component. A very interesting relationship.
Now, I have one question. I think someone's going to say
No,
something about time, are you?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, is you guys have been going for a long time now, and 12:30. So we just feel
Just
like,
making sure you get your money's worth. You haven't got the bill yet.
well, yeah, whatever it is.
I think the
what
two
it
days
is,
could go
yeah.
on forever.
It's
We
basically
could.
what I was going to
We could
say
do
is, like, I could just have you in this 4 square meters and you'd be totally fine.
Oh, yeah.
To talk.
We could have done that
couple
up
of
at the
days.
smoking, talk about the Maya. I've got one question for you, Dave.
Oh, right.
What's your opinion on Ksenia?
Oh, such an interesting question. Well, I've had a special affection for Ksenias. Let's go over and look at one of them. This is one of our most common Ksenias. We call this Ksenia Longifolia. Who's got my species list? Just to show you on my list that where I live, I have several Ksenias. I'll just try and find the page. So we have a Ksenia aculeata, the common Ksenia, often called dogwood. Then we have Ksenia arcuata, which has changed its name since I printed this list.
Yep.
It's now renamed itself Ksenia sifton, and that is a very controversial plant because the person who described that new species name for that very common thing that we call, we actually simply call it drooping Ksenia or coffee bush or all sorts of other names, or Chinese scrub. There's a very interesting reason why it's called Chinese scrub, especially since today everyone's trying to blame the Chinese for the coronavirus. But there are now some people, some authorities that hold that it's an exotic and it's gone wild from somewhere in Western New South Wales and is now to be found all over most of Victoria. So that's common in this area. But there's no question that the third one on my list, Ksenia longifolia, the shiny Ksenia, which is what this example is, but we could find 2 or even 3 in this bush if we look. They're a terribly important plant ecologically because after a fire, they germinate from wind-borne seed that blows in from an adjacent area. And only if you have small-scale fires will there be donor areas that have seed to blow in. If you burn the lot to a crisp in the whole area, there will be no seed to come in because it's all gone. And the seed doesn't last long. It's blown around and it's blown by wind into adjacent areas. So burning in a patch manner maintains this in the landscape. And while people have a lot of critical things to say about Ksenia, to me, it's one of those things that we would call nature's Band-Aid. Because the moment you have soil disturbance, like after the gold rush periods, particularly when the Chinese came through and reworked the mullock heaps, the spoil heaps from the gold fields, after the European miners couldn't be bothered with what was left at the end because it was too much hard work, the Chinese would come through and they'd rework it and they'd get the last bit of gold that was there and they'd make a living out of that. And they left such a terribly finely degraded spoil heap all over the landscape that the thing that came back after that most prolifically was the plant that has now renamed itself. Well, we used to call it Ksenia arcuata, we now call it Ksenia sifton. And so the Ksenia sifton was growing so prolifically in the goldfields after the Chinese had moved on that that's one of the 2 possible reasons why it's been called the Chinese scrub or Chinese bush or coffee bush or whatever.
Would you say, in your opinion, not as well, working with fire ecologists, in the numbers that you see, just looking through here now,
Now, I
that
see
it's in
that.
proportion.
Look, let me just say this. Back in the 80s, I developed a method for assessing the health of the vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my components was, well, one was the physical disturbance levels.
Yep.
The second component was the diversity of native species. The third measure was the degree of infiltration of exotic weeds. And the fourth and most subtle concept was ecological balance. And I pointed out that sometimes you might still have all the native species, but the balance between the different species was not appropriate.
Yep.
It was too many eucalypts, which would dry the site out, like a lot of the box ironbark forests in the ironbark regions of the state to the north. And this is a little outlier, so this is actually part of that. And nearby here in Panton Hill, we actually have ironbarks as well. So we have the full complement of box ironbark species in this area. But the point I want to make is that you can have too many of the right thing, and that's not a good thing.
Yep.
And so when you have way too much of any one species, it is often an indicator that the ecological process is what's changed.
That's right.
And it's the ecological process of having too much fire, too frequent fire, not enough fire, too much grazing of the wrong kind. And now with climate change, way too many drought stresses, you know, periods of intense and protracted drought stress on top of increasing frequency of fire. And then you get the lethal combination of what I call, or what we call, ecologically recruitment failure, where things fail to recruit after what was previously a natural event.
Yep.
And then you lose certain elements, but instead you get other things that cope very well with that changed regime. And with everything we've thrown at this landscape since the time of the expulsion of the Aboriginals and their practices, the gold rush, and then all of the heavy grazing, the cutting of the forests, the extraction of the timber, all of that disturbance, the invasion by weeds, the invasion by lots of little tiny things that we pay little attention to, insects, Portuguese, millipedes, etc., red-legged mites, anything alike. We throw that at the landscape, things we don't even notice, and diseases like Phytophthora cinnamomi. We end up having a landscape overly dominated by certain even native species.
Correct.
One of them that's a signature of that ecological imbalance, what I call the issue of ecological balance being not right, is excess of this Ksenia. Now, I'm very fond of Ksenia. In the right amount, the right ages, it is, as I said, part of nature's band-aid. It's a band-aid it's putting a band-aid over an ecologically disastrous history. But we often get stuck with these. So we get too many black wattles. We get too many Ksenias.
I'm glad you agree with me on the black wattle as well.
So there's nothing wrong with a species. People don't like mistletoes. I'm very fond of mistletoes. When you have way too many mistletoes, it's nearly always because we've isolated the trees, we've reduced their vigor, they get overloaded by mistletoes. There are very few trees left in the paddocks for the mistletoe birds to land on. They overload them with seed. They all germinate, and we end up having what people then blame the mistletoe for, and that is dieback of the eucalyptus. So they are a symptom. And so often what we fail to understand is it's the underlying regime, the fire regime, the grazing regime. Now it's a climate regime, which we can't do. Well, yes, we could do something about it. We could stop saying that Australia is only contributing a fraction of the the global emissions. But of course, that's a false argument, because if every country that produced only less than 1% didn't do anything, well, that's 40% of the world's global emissions is from those nations. So that's just one other little point.
Good. So one of the things I get asked to do with Ksenia, especially where it's almost a monoculture, is to actually burn it out. So that's one way you can use fire to reduce that imbalance. But it's not always practical to do so. So sometimes you actually have to spend the money and go in and do it by hand and cut it out by hand. So Ksenia, when it goes up, it creates this ladder which allows your larger forest fires to happen, but it's nowhere near as bad as things like your Bergen, which of course you only got to go around the corner a bit to get across to all your Bergen.
Oh, don't start me on Bergen. People blame Bergen for the wrong thing. Every time people go out of their way to blame Bergen, I say, Bergen is also, that's where that phrase I just used, my colleague Lindley Smith, now Lindley Tozer, she once wrote, well, at least it went into a local paper, she used the phrase that Bergen, Kunzea, there's different names. I've helped everybody learn that the ones in this area are Bergens. The one that I've known, Yarra Bergen, is Ksenia Longifolia, and the other one doesn't yet have a formal name, but I've given it the name forest burgon. So the forest burgon's in more sheltered places in our district, and everywhere else it's the Yarra burgon, which has an old name, goes right back to Mueller's day, Ksenia Longifolia. People blame the burgon when actually what's happened is we've thrown far too many excessive pressures onto the landscape.
That's right.
We've cut the forest down, we've overburnt it, we've overgrazed it, we've not done the right thing. And what you end up with is overdominance. It's this lack of ecological balance, where now you have this hugely flammable plant. And I always advise people, if you want to do something about your burgon, don't get rid of it. Simply isolate parts of it so you have a patch here and a patch there, which is natural. Don't have continuity, don't have it come right up to your house. If it's right next to your house, of course, eliminate it. But beyond that, don't eliminate it because it is nature's band-aid. If there's a certain amount there, it will remain in harmony with the rest of the landscape as long as you do your contribution to the correct fire regime, if you understand what that is. Take away certain grazing animals, control certain other pests. If you can, don't introduce Phytophthora, etc., etc., etc. Pull out your exotic weeds like Pittosporum undulatum, which is growing everywhere here, comes from East Gippsland as far west, in my personal opinion, Western Port Bay, but not the rest of the Melbourne area. So now where we have that exotic plant, only 100 kilometres away from where it was at the time of settlement, it is now a hugely invasive species. And it changes our landscape into a false rainforest. I love rainforests. I spent my entire career working on rainforests, but I don't want this bushland turned into rainforest at the expense of all the other species here. So we've got to pull the Pittosporums out when we're in the wrong place, where it shouldn't be. And when it comes to Ksenia, I've been involved in advising council staff and other managers in places to judiciously thin out the Ksenias, but never eliminate it, never remove them all. And if you have to, do it only in a patchy way, because that's the way of nature is. Things like to grow in groups. They like to be patchy, because between the patches of one species, there's room for patches of something else. That's right.
It's about living in harmony with each other.
Exactly.
And not having the overdominance. So that's what, before our fire regimes were stopped.
Dave,
hang on.
Focus on this. Chinese scrub. There it is.
There we go.
There we have the second of the Ksenias.
This is the other one.
Of the, yes, so there they are together. The shiny and the one that people call Chinese scrub or drooping Ksenia. Now the correct name for that is Ksenia sifton. Some people say it's exotic from New South Wales. Other people contend very vigorously and strongly. Some of my colleagues are completely divided. Some are on the side, no, it's native. Don't give me that rubbish that it was collected first in New South Wales and only later here, because some of the records go right back to about the same time. So the jury is out scientifically over whether the documentary evidence supports it being exotic or naturalised, but I'm absolutely of the view, and all of my colleagues are, that much of its current range in Victoria, it is what we call naturalised. It is moving in because we've done so many things in the landscape that favour this plant, and it's being spread everywhere. So it is truly on the march. There are other states of Australia where it has truly arrived from New South Wales, maybe Victoria, and it's now moving into South Australia, in places, Western Australia and elsewhere. But as I say, the scientific jury is out on whether this is a native plant or not. Once again, it's to do with that ecological balance. I'm very fond of seeing it. I love it for its smell. It's something I would use as a bit of a, it's got the most beautiful sort of fragrance that lends itself to being put into a stew.
Cinnamon type of fragrance.
Yes, that's right. It's a spice. It's a lovely natural spice. So in balance, not a problem. Too much, that is a problem.
So one of the things before our fire regimes were stopped is that we still talk about today, is our fire was done in such a way that it was not ever about getting rid of a species. It was about making sure that species stayed within their home ground. So things like you talk about the burgon, that does belong down in the bottom of the gullies. But if you don't keep it under control, either by manual work or by fire, hang on, I'll just finish this off, or fire, that it will march up the landscape and start dominating and losing the biodiversity. Everything does have its home. It's about now what we call sending it back home. It's about maintaining the borders just as we did tribally to where things were actually needed. So it's something we need to think about as we're doing our reduction of species to maintain balance. Fire is not the answer, the one answer to everything. There's sometimes going to be a lot of manual labour required to be able to restore some places back to health.
Dave, I said before that my swan song was going to be the elfin cover butterfly story.
Yep.
Since then, we've had a few more swan songs. I'll just add one more. Can you focus on this here?
Yep.
This here is a liverwort, and growing right next to it is a moss. So the moss is a species of swan-neck moss, Campylopus, and this liverwort here is a species of Chiloscyphus. We used to call it all semiteres. This is actually the most widespread species of liverwort that we have in our entire landscape. It grows from forest to rainforest to drier forest like here, and right out into drier country and even in sandy country. So what these things are doing is they're forming what we call a crust. At the time of European settlement, much of our actual soil surfaces, like we showed you back down there in the food, fibre and medicine garden, the fenced area to keep out the deer, and I guess the rabbits, what we had at the time of settlement was a lot of the soil surfaces were protected, and also by lichens. If you look at this, here we are with a lichen alongside the mosses and the liverworts. So here's lichens.
Yeah.
So we've got the moss there, we've got the lichen there, and we've got the little liverwort as well. What these things were doing was providing a crust that protected the soil. It protected the humus. This is this dark stuff, the topsoil, the breakdown of the leaf litter. And it actually provided the correct conditions for the germination of nearly all of the higher plants. And this happens to be a terribly important plant here. This is chocolate lily, Dicopogon, or Arthropodium now. So
another nice plant, but definitely
a very
one
important
that is
food plant.
Very, very dangerous for young children to eat half a dozen of those. Can potentially kill them if it's not cooked.
People need to know correctly. It's like eating fungi. You really need to be well informed, know what the species is, know what you can do with it. But the point about these crusts is the moment Europeans arrived with their heavy hooved animals, their hard hooved animals, and their rabbits that went scratching them up, and terribly important in this landscape here, these sclerophyll bushland areas, is they introduced, of all things, the blackbird. And these creatures dug up the soil. They destroyed that highly protective mat of material that, look here, look how dense it is. Look at this, Dave. Here it is actually, it is 100% of the soil is protected by the mosses in this case. Here we've got a different moss species. That's called Rosulibryum billarderi. So the Rosulibryum billarderi here, the liverwort I mentioned over there before, the other moss that I showed you, the swan neck moss, all these different species protected 100% of the soil that was not being covered by tussocks or emergent plants or anything else. And look at the density here, 100% of one species, the sundew. Now what the blackbird scratchings have done, what the hard-hooved animals have done, what the deer are now doing, the sambar in this area in particular, they have eliminated this protective layer, and that's led to the erosion of our soil, and that's allowed a lot more weeds to take root, and it's eliminated the habitat and the conditions for germination of our native species. So the whole thing is a very complicated ecological web where they are all interconnected. And when we do one thing to change the landscape, we do it at our peril, because from that flows a whole series of consequential side effects, like far too much of a native species, like the Ksenia, like overabundance of certain eucalypts even, or black wattles, for example, or the Kunzi or the bird.
Now, it's one of the things that we've recorded quite diligently, that when we do our burning,
Dave, look at this.
That when we do our burning, that we actually don't actually damage this. And we've got good photographic evidence.
Dave, look at this. Isn't this just gorgeous?
Because we as Aboriginal people also knew that these were important. And
just hold it back a bit
even when I was in, went up and looked at some burns that the Aboriginal people have been doing in Canberra for about 6 years now. It's the one thing that they burn much more frequently than we've been able to down here, and yet not once has a moss been killed in all their fires. They weren't even noticing it till I pointed it out to them.
I reckon I'm going to totally interrupt now, because you guys are so on.
We're on fire.
Totally on fire.
We're on
Well,
fire.
it's such a nice day to be doing it. You know, they promised us rain, it didn't come.
Hey, I wanted to, as you guys have been talking, I just was thinking
Sorry to
about.
get a bit too excited there.
No, it's great. I was thinking about the Divine Dave title of this webinar, and it made me think of this Indigenous academic Brian Martin, who talked about, you know, non-colonial knowledge coming through, Indigenous knowledge in particular coming through, and how it can work with
Pre-colonial knowledge.
Pre-colonial, but also thinking of bringing all these knowledge systems together, like Western. And I just felt like just then, he uses the word shimmer when things can start to shimmer. And I felt like this has just been so shimmering today. And there's this divine light going on.
Yeah.
And I just really wanted to thank you so much from us here. I don't know what it's like at home, but it's been a pretty awesome experience for us. So really, really appreciate it.
Well, I will say, even though that David works for DELP, I know that he works as an...
I'm not an apologist for what DELP
Yeah,
does.
no, I know that. But he works as an independent, basically, and he advises DELP. And I guess as a botanist, might not have the same restrictions, but I know when I first started talking with DELP and it was about fire, it's like everybody put their hands up in the air. So most of the people I've had to deal with have a role in fire, and that's been very, very difficult. But getting on the ground together, scientists, Aboriginal, discussing, pointing out, everything that we're saying backwards and forwards, when you hear it spoken together, not a paper here and a paper here presented on a PowerPoint,
shimmers.
You can see that it does actually, we're talking the same language, we want the same outcomes.
Yeah, and the harmonies.
Yes.
And
there's just, it's about
inspiring.
working out the right way or a combination of methodologies to get the outcome that we are all seeking, whether you're the Aboriginal, white, whatever colour you are, whatever country you're from.
And of course, one of the most important aspects of this, being able to get to that point of shimmer, is to have respect and listen to what the other person says.
Yeah, two eyes, two ears, and one mouth to do the talking.
And I get a bit excited because this is all, these issues are so important to me. I've been living and breathing these concepts and developing them for, for the last 45 years or whatever of my life. But it's so nice to be able to do that in company with someone who's not only doing it because of their one life's experience, but because they're bringing into their own self-awareness a whole heritage that goes back for so much longer than the tiny, tiny period of time that we've had European settlement in Australia. We've only been here 200 years.
You get a piece of string and say, okay, that piece of string is 200 years, and then try and stretch that string out even to 70,000 years. Well, that string disappears right off over there. Well, we survived for however long that piece of string is, actually really successfully, because of the knowledge we had of the landscape.
Well,
we didn't put as much pressure on it as what's happened in the last 200 years, admittedly.
Jim Berg, who's an Aboriginal elder.
Yes.
You know Jim. He,
I've hung up. No, I haven't. I've stopped recording, have I?
Jim Berg did a presentation.
Yes, that's my... it's a ringtail possum, which is my totem. Yeah.
Jim Berg did a presentation at a library. I think it was somewhere like Kensington anyway, an inner northwestern suburb. And at that presentation, he did what he does repeatedly. He brings his tape measure.
Yes.
And he stood at one end of the library where he's giving this presentation. And then he walked, or he got one of his kids or somebody to walk to the other end of the building and out onto the street and across the main road to the other side. And he said, now that is the 70 or 65,000 years. And then he showed how much is the period of time since European settlement. Since then, we've had that work by Jim Bowler and his associates down at Warrnambool at the mouth of the river, which shows that it's just possible. They're not absolutely clear about it. They say the evidence is not clear, but it is now possible that this was an Aboriginal fire 120,000 years ago, which opens a spectrum to a much longer period of being on country. We already know that Aboriginals have been on country for longer than any other culture on Earth. To our knowledge, ever has. There's no other community of people, no other ethnicity, no other community, no other language group that has been in the one place for as long as the Aboriginal culture has been on country. And we have the genetic evidence that comes from hair samples brought together from all over Australia, and held at a museum in Adelaide, which when analysed showed that the people who are most related to each other are always the groups nearest to each other across the entire continent. Where they arrived in the north at the time when it was actually connected through to New Guinea and some of the islands of what's now Indonesia, yep. Timor, and they moved around the coast and met up in southern Australia, what is now South Australia, and moved in and occupied the entire continent. The relationships between the hair samples genetically shows that the same people that took residence in one part of Australia have never moved. Otherwise, the relationships would not always be that the closest relatives were the ones nearby. What it shows is that they have been on country for an essential eternity, yep. Anywhere from 65 to 120,000 years. Yep. We're not really sure yet scientifically how early that was, but this is a unique thing in all of global history as far as we know, yeah. That one people have been on country knowing and adjusting to what's changing in that landscape
being and doing
for such a terribly long period of time. Yep. And for that reason, as modern day European-based scientists, as I am, a botanist, an ecologist, a conservation biologist, we have to listen with respect to what the records tell us and to what Aboriginals, particularly the elders like you, tell us, and we need to be in dialogue to come to a meeting point where we are achieving the same things with the same objectives, using common methods, yep. And bring those different methods together.
Go out and test all the new ideas you want,
yes,
but don't do it at the discounting of old ideas or old knowledge.
Yes.
And if we keep working towards that, we'll achieve harmony. Yeah.
Can I beam in from Montmorency with a final comment?
We're getting you there in the background, yeah.
Sorry, Penelope here. Many people have said in the chat line there should be a YouTube channel with you two on, and subscribe for sure. And
that's a divine idea.
I love it.
Yeah. And another person has asked, how can we help? A lot of people were feeling that, and I would really strongly suggest that you join your local land care groups, and then
that's always the best start. Yeah.
And require that there is Indigenous knowledge brought into the land care group, so that that is right from the get-go the parameter that the group is working under.
Can I just say that to me it's a terribly important principle that you start locally, you get local knowledge and you work out from that, because one of the greatest mistakes in an entire continent is to think that one size fits all, that one management approach will suffice across an entire continent. If you said that to somebody from Germany, someone from Spain and Italy, and someone from Scotland or Finland or Russia, if you said to all of them, let's do the same thing across all of Europe, they'd laugh at you, they'd kick you out of the room and say, no, we've got horses for courses, we do what we need to in our own areas, with our own language, our own landscapes, our own management history, and our own local conditions. And the same applies to an entire continent like Australia, that no single paradigm should or ever be expected to work across an entire continent. We've got to have local knowledge, local approaches, and if we can generalize that to elsewhere, then that's fine, but we've got to test it against what's going on locally and what the local knowledge is. Yeah. And there might be some parts of this fire paradigm, this climate change paradigm, anything else we like, these paradigms of how to deal with pests and weeds and exotics. Some of them might work everywhere, but most of them will have to be locally adapted.
That's right. And fire, that's what I keep saying about fire. You know, everyone talks about Aboriginal fire, but Aboriginal fire in Queensland is different to Aboriginal fire in Victoria.
Should be.
The methodology of assessing a fire or when to put a fire in is the same. It's actually the same worldwide.
Yes, exactly.
It's the timing.
It's listening locally.
Yes, exactly. It's being where you are as to knowing the right time when to apply the fire. The methodology is all the same. And in fact, our most respected fire elder does actually teach Native Americans and the Canadians, Victor Stephenson. Yeah. And you talked about fires in Greenland. He even does. He actually teaches native Finland, the native people there who actually have total say over their lands, how to use fire in that landscape. The methodology is the same. Just the timing is different.
While we're talking about timing, I think that we actually need to
close off. Yeah.
I'm going to cut you off.
Yeah, that's all right. It's not the first time.
Go I'm gonna press the red button in like 5 seconds. So
Okay.
thank you, everybody.
Well,
Thank
I
you.
just want to say thank you to all your listeners today. I hope you got something out of it. Direct your questions to Paradoxa Collective.
Viewers, not just listeners. Dave.
Oh, well, viewers as well, yeah. And I think this is a great format. When you think we were only going to get 30 people here.
Absolutely.
And imagine if we had 400 people walking around here today.
Impossible. Think of
We
the
would have
damage
done
we'd
as
be
much
doing.
damage as what those pigs and deer and the gold miners did
Yes.
with that many people. So I hope you enjoyed the experience, and thank you very much for joining in today.
And thank you to Paradoxa Cooperative for facilitating this, and of course to Nillumbik Shire for officiating it behind the scenes.
Cool. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.